start off by answering a question that Coleman, the other Coleman, it's a rare delight that it's a multi-Coleman event.
Very rare.
Before I get to what I actually have to say, he asked me what is the origin of the name Coleman. So my goal tonight is not to tell you the origins of names, but you're here and you asked. There are two major theories. Okay? The first theory is that Coleman is derived from Shem Tov. Shem Tov, meaning good name in Hebrew, entered Greek as Kalanimus. Kalanimus became a common European Jewish name. Kalanimus morphed into Coleman over time. That's theory one. It's a very nice theory because it shows internal Jewish continuity. Through different languages, Jewish continuity. The other theory is that Coleman is a medieval European name of Latin origin that has entered multiple European languages, including Hungarian as Kalman, Yiddish as Kalman, and a few other European languages. So the jury is out, but maybe that will be my future project, the origins of Coleman.
In researching our name, I learned kalonimus from the Greek because kalo means good.
Yeah, it means good name, means Shem Tov. Right,
Same as
yeah.
Shem Tov. Yes.
Because my mother's family is from Greece, a Yiddish linguist. Actually, you may know this guy. Fortunately, he's now deceased. Michael Herzog, Marvin Herzog, Toronto-born scholar who became professor of Yiddish at Columbia. He asked me decades ago, was I named Coleman because my family's from Greece? And right, it's a name according to this theory of Greek origin. But no, it's because my astronaut grandfather was named Coleman. But we'll come back to naming after living in the dead later. Okay, this talk is really an outgrowth of a lot of stuff I've been working on for years. I have an article coming out soon about naming controversies in Poland. The controversies, the problems and controversies surrounding Jews' names in Poland from the 1860s until 1939. So I had names on my mind for quite some time, and of course longer, right? Who doesn't think about names at some point? Naming is of a kind of a hot topic for multiple reasons, or at least on people's minds for multiple reasons. One of the most common reasons is genealogical research. If you do any genealogical research about Jews, you're likely to come across barriers. Those barriers have to do with, this I took from the Jewish genealogy website, have to do with Jews' names morphing by decade, country, and language. Names spelled according to Polish spelling, according to Yiddish spelling, according to Russian spelling, names changing upon immigration, and so on. Presents enormous problems for people who aren't skilled. The whole field of Jewish names is a massive and complicated field. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of backstories about names before I get to the meat of the talk. I specialize in Poland. There used to be a joke in early 20th century, pre-World War II, Poland about Jewish names, or about anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. There was a genre of humor in Poland, kind of like vaudeville, jokes by Jews, often on Jewish subjects for Jewish and non-Jewish audiences, called schmonzes. And the joke runs something like this, right? It's hard to know whether this is an actually anti-Semitic contention or this was just a joke, but this is circulated. How do you know that America is controlled by the Jews? And the answer is, quite simply, all of their founding fathers have names like Benjamin, Abraham, right? Isaac. These are obviously biblical names. Jews are not the only ones who use biblical names, but Poles use a different set of biblical names than Jews do, right? No Pole is named Abraham, no Pole is named Benjamin, right? But they do name Adam, which no Jew names, right? Adam is another biblical name, but it's very rare for a Jew in Poland to use the name Adam. In fact, it's very rare in European, I would say probably in 1,000 years of European Jewish history to name your child Adam.
And for cousin Adam.
We're not in Europe.
Younger generation.
We'll go back to this. At some point in that year, about 1964, where my brother's name is Adam, at some point names like Adam become popular. We'll get there, okay? There's obviously a sociology behind what marks names as Jewish and not Jewish, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with the origins of the name. We'll see that. I'm going this is a quote from Shulam Aleicham's story from the draft, which summarizes some of the problems that arose in the 19th century. The background for this is in the 19th century, Jews begin to take names. Right? It begins a little bit earlier in some places, but for the most part in European society, Ashkenazi Jews at least, Sephardic Jews earlier, but by the 19th century, Ashkenazi Jews begin to take family names and fixed first names. The state wants you to have a fixed name. This doesn't only affect Jews, it affects everybody, but we're dealing here with Jews, and Jews present certain, how should I say, unique problems. Jews traditionally offer multiple names to their children depending on context, as you'll see in this story. The problem has to do here with draft of the Russian army. This dramatizes the problem, one of the problems at least. To make a long story short, what's the use of long-winded histories and twice-told tales? They were summoning my Itzik Alta, that is, to the draft board once again. My wife, bless her, raised the roof. My daughter-in-law passed out. It was perfectly disgraceful. Travel the length and breadth of the entire world and see if you'll find one instance where an only son, a one and only boy with an honest-to-goodness officially attested to first-class exemption, should be called to the draft board 3 times, right? In the Russian army, if you're the only son, you're not supposed to be called, right? You're the breadwinner for the family. And here the only son gets called 3 times for the draft. But go talk Turkish or Tatar, there was nothing to be done. So I ran to our communal leaders and shouted blue murder. I just about succeeded in getting 10 people to swear on an affidavit saying that they were positive that Itzik is Avram Yitzchak, that Avram Yitzchak was Alter, and that Alter and Itzik and Avram Yitzchak were all one and the same person. Okay? The problem, which dramatizes an actual problem, is that Jewish names have to be registered by communal authorities, usually by government-appointed rabbis or other government officials. They did not necessarily write down what the parents said what the name was. They often corrected the name to what they thought was an appropriate name or the way they heard it. If your child died, you then had to present to the draft board a death certificate. The death certificate, which may have been filled out by another communal rabbi, another government-appointed rabbi or state official, may register a different variant of the name. When you show that to the draft board, your child, they say, this is not proof, give me your son. And you can imagine this goes on in multiple variations because I call my child Yitzchak, my wife calls him Itz. His actual name is Yitzchak, is Avram Yitzchak, but because the child was sick when he was born and nearly died, we renamed him Alter. So the child has multiple names for multiple contexts. The government, the state, needs you to have one name for all contexts. This causes mass confusion, and of course, czarist officials do not understand Jewish naming practices, and typically government rabbis who are enlightened Jews, maskilim, don't think very much of Yiddish names. They believe that the child should be called Isaac, and that's it. So all of this creates tremendous problems when you don't have the right name on the form. Right? So there are lots of stories like this. Also stories of Jews being what we call today racially profiled based on the names that appear on their passports. You know, I'm a perfectly acculturated Polish or Russian-speaking Jew, but my name on the passport says Itzik. You know, you don't back, you know, to the end of the line, or you're not putting it through, or whatever else. Discriminatory treatment. And there are various other kinds of, that sounds funny to us today, but humiliation, discrimination that Jews face in the Tsarist Empire based on their names. And of course, it's not only Russia, but Russia is, of course, the best case for this. Jewish names are a problem. This is recognized by the mid-19th century. What I have here are just 2 pictures. One is from the 1860s on the left, one is from a bit later, the early 20th century, attempts to reform Jewish names. The first attempt is by an enlightened Jew who works for the Polish Jewish community in Warsaw. What he does is he compiles a list of names used by Jews, and then he Romanizes them, so that Jews who are getting more civil rights in central Poland at this time can go to state authorities and write on their legitimation papers, the birth certificates, what the name is, and it'll be intelligible to Polish officials. So if your child's name is, I don't know, Yetin, what should you write on your birth certificate? Well, it will tell you, and it tries to standardize it. So all the parents who call their child Yetin will write whatever, you know, Ita, you should write Yudit on it, okay? It's meant to standardize and facilitate bureaucratic processes so the state authorities can deal with it and the Jews are not humiliated and there isn't mass confusion. The Jews don't listen. They don't listen for a number of reasons. They don't listen, first of all, because the Jews, their names, they're not really interested in 1860 what the state has to say about their names. The Jews are not acculturated to state norms enough yet for it to matter. Jews don't really care very much about the names they have, state-given names or family names that we'll get to, until much later in the 19th century. The same thing with all birth and death type features. You know, when is your child born? During Pesach. The year the cow died. Right? These things, the intrusion of the modern state, which wants to measure and control the populations for its own benefit, introduce public education and so on, the benefits of this are largely lost on the Jews. And they're not always such benefits, such as military drafts, for people who aren't citizens. Okay, so that's the first attempt in Poland to standardize Jewish names and register them. It's also, this book is written in Polish. So you can imagine no Jew in Warsaw or Poland in the 1860s, or almost no Jew, can actually pick up a book in Polish and read it. It's really a show, an attempt for enlightened Jews to begin to introduce a measure of standardization, and a show to authorities that the Jews are cleaning up their act and getting on board with becoming what they hope will be citizens. There's a long set of paragraphs in the book, in fact in the introduction, talking about the benefits of conforming with state law, and how these things matter. But of course no Jew, or almost no Jew, can read this. The second one comes a bit later. It's the, in the 1920s, the Warsaw Jewish community is under Zionist leadership. It's a democratically elected Kehila, community board, and Zionists are in the majority, and they try to introduce a reform of Jewish names. But they do it along nationalist lines, meaning that they create, again, lists of names as used by people, and they have a column, one column for incorrect name, which is the Yiddish name, obviously, and then there's the correct name. The correct name is the Polish variant of the name, according to the standard translation of the Bible in Polish, or a modern Hebrew variant. There's obviously clearly Zionist leaning to this. Jewish names have to be standardized and made simple so they're coherent and, how shall I say, transparent to state authorities, written in Roman letters, which they need to be. And of course, a proper Jewish name is a Jewish national Hebrew name, or a Jewish biblical name in its Polish variant, not its Yiddish variant. So, of course, Abraham is okay because it's used in Polish, Abraham, but not Avram, Avramo, Avramchik, and so on. Okay? Moshe, Meshke, and so on, not acceptable, but Moshe, the Polish variant is, and so is Moshe. There's a lot, it's not very, how shall I say, scientifically consistent. A lot of the names actually are in the Yiddish variant, not the Polish variant, or they screwed up at times. Sometimes they recognize that, look, we can't change everything overnight. Certain names like Mendel. Mendel is Yiddish, it's not Hebrew, it's not Polish, we just have to put Mendel on the list and hope that one day Mendel will die. It's not scientifically very well done, but it was meant to an attempt to introduce norms. And that's 1927. And, oh, by the way, it was written in multiple languages. It was written, the introductions in Hebrew, Polish, and Yiddish, because they wanted people to understand. And there was an attempt to install this, to that all the Jewish community officials throughout Poland should get a copy of this and, convince the parents to name their children appropriately. The parents, you can imagine, because you probably met Polish Jews, did not conform. The parents were Polonized, and they were beginning to speak Polish by the 1920s, but they tended to give traditional Jewish names, or they would give Polish names with a Yiddish diminutive. And the Polish Jews basically continued the practice of having multiple names for different contexts. One name at home, one name at school, one name in the street, one name at work. Polish Jewish naming practices are very, very complicated. Okay. All right, the stigma of names of Nazi Germany, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Obviously, Jewish names have become very dangerous in the Nazi period. The Nazis weren't satisfied that Jews were adequately recognizable, so they began to demand that Jews who did not have recognizable Jewish names have Sarah or Israel inserted as middle names. But there were even cases before this in Germany where people brought libel suits. There's a famous case of a man, I think his name was White, and he was, someone was denouncing him. Jewish surnames became an epithet. Right? You either called someone by a certain Jewish surname, and that became an epithet. Certain names were known to be Jewish names. Or you called them by a stereotypical Jewish name that had nothing to do with them. There was a famous anti-Semitic character in the 19th century, Isaac Feitel. He is a quintessential Yiddish-speaking Jew. You called someone an Itzik, you know whom they're talking about. Okay? So there were actually court cases in Weimar, Germany. He's defaming me. How is he defaming me? He called me Itzik, or he called me Weiss. But Weiss is a perfectly normal name. Yes, when he says Weiss, he means the Jew. Because my name is actually, I don't know, Tucholsky or something like this, right? And they brought evidence to show that these names were being specifically used to how should I say, in a pejorative way. Of course, the Nazis went a step further by marking people's papers to show that they were Jewish. The Soviet Union had its policy, of course, later of demasking Zionists, in quotation marks, Zionists being Jews, by putting people's names in parentheses. Often Jews had names that had been changed if they were in the party. Stalin is not a Jew. His name, of course, was Yugoslavia, not Stalin. Many Bolsheviks in the early years changed their names, and there are plenty of Jews who did this. Lev Bronstein is Trotsky, right? So you write, they don't do this Trotsky, but you write Trotsky, and you write parentheses, you write Bronstein. Okay, even the guy doesn't call himself that. Or sometimes the Jews have names that just aren't recognizably Jewish, so you put a name that's recognizably Jewish, not the original name. And this is a way of, nowadays in the internet, when you want to mark a Jew, you put parentheses or something around them. This was already being done by the Soviets, okay, to expose Jews. So names obviously have many dangers involved with them, as well as that being a source of identity for positive reasons. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the origins of Jewish names and Jewish naming practices, and bring us up to date today, as best as I can, with the remainder of the talk. So first of all, what you're seeing here is a book, A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, which is a very interesting book that came out a year or two ago by a scholar named Kirsten Fermanagh. And her introduction is very funny. She says something to the effect of, with a name like Kirsten Fermanagh, I had to write a book about names. Neither name makes sense. No one can pronounce Fermanagh. And they all think that the name Kirsten doesn't go with Fermanagh. It's an oxymoron. It's like naming your kid Christopher Levy. You may have seen there's a soldier in the U.S. who's now suing the Iranian government. He lost his legs, and his accusation is because the Iranian government had funded the bomb and provided the training that led to him losing his legs. The guy's name is Chris Levy. And I don't know the guy's background, but it obviously strikes you as Christopher as the archetypical non-Jewish name, Christian name, and Levy is the archetypical Jewish name. Okay, so she writes a book about this. Her main motivation, or what she traces in this, is the Jewish naming practices in the United States in the 20th century. How they changed their names. Jews changed their last names in the United States for many reasons. The story about Ellis Island, that names were randomly changed or arbitrarily changed, she disproves. There were many translators at Ellis Island. People did not come and lose their names. Their names were changed either because they wanted to change them. Well, the names were changed because they wanted to change them, basically. And most of the name changes don't happen at Ellis Island. They happen subsequently. Usually people have been in the country for a while, and for a variety of reasons they change their family names. Because they have relatives who already changed their names. They want, Grunkovsky wants to be green because his brother and sisters are green. Anti-Semitism, job opportunities, the names they feel are foreign and complicated. There's a whole wide variety of reasons why Jews change their names. And she traces the highs and lows. Jewish name practices, naming changes really spike around the 1940s and 1960s, and then they drop down. I won't give you the whole story, read the book, but it's quite interesting what you can learn about the social history of American Jews based on the names they give their children and how they change their names. Okay, so A Rosenberg by Any Name is itself a funny title. My first thing I said is, what is a Jewish name? For most people in North America, Rosenberg sounds Jewish. Okay, I'm not going to explain to you why. You probably have enough experience with North American Jews of Ashkenazi origins to know that Rosenberg is a common Jewish name. There was a TV show, The Goldbergs. Was there a TV show, The Rosenbergs, at some time? I don't know. But you may also know that Rosenberg was a famous Nazi ideologue, right? In other words, there's nothing inherently Jewish about a name like Rosenberg. It's a German name that Jews acquire at some point. And there are non-Jews who have it. but in our context in North America, it's associated as a Jewish name. My family name, Weisel, I like going to Germany because I never have to spell my name. Where my brother lives in Columbus, Ohio, everyone assumes that he's part of the the Ohio Weisers, who are a nice German Christian family. Same name, not probably related to us, right? Different context, names that seem stereotypically Jewish are not necessarily Jewish, okay? But there are certain names that are very commonly Jewish, and it has to do with the frequency of those names amongst Jews. What is the proper form of Jewish names? This is a question that was touched upon already in Poland, but I'll deal with it here a bit. Are Jewish names meant to be of Jewish origin, non-Jewish origin? Are there a right way? Is there a wrong way? There's debates throughout the centuries about this kind of stuff. So I thought I'd play a game with you to see how much you know. You'll probably do very well. My students will fail, right? Because I'm getting older, and my source material is getting dated. Okay? Or at least I haven't updated it. I ask people, Isidore Schwartz, Scott Schwartz, Chaim Schwartz, Max and Rose Schwartz. Who are these people? Where are they from? How old are they? You'll probably get 100 on this quiz. Or at least do very well. If you hear of someone called Isidore Schwartz, how old do you think this guy is and where is he from?
100.
He's 100. What's his social background?
Eastern Europe.
Okay, he's probably either from Eastern Europe, or Europe at least, or the child of Eastern European immigrants to somewhere, right? This is a name that is familiar with Jews in North America in the early 20th century. There's a certain number of names that are Jewish, and they tend to be names associated with royalty in Europe. Names like Stanley and Isidore are very common, right? Those were names associated with Burton. They're high-class names that Jews take in very large numbers in places like New York and Toronto or Montreal in the English-speaking world. Of course, at home, Isidore may have been called Izzy or at school or something like this. He probably had Yiddish-speaking parents. But in the street, at least on paper, he was probably Isidore. Amongst his friends, he was maybe Izzy, something like this. All right, then I say, who was Scott Schwartz? Who was Scott Schwartz? Where is he from?
His grandson.
What's that?
He's Isidore's grandson.
It's quite possible this is that's right. This is likely a Jew born in the American Midwest sometime in the 1960s to early 1970s. Okay. In my family, because my family's from Greece, there's a taboo of the name Scott because it sounds too much like the Greek word for feces. You know the word scatological? I think that's crazy, but that's a family taboo. But I'm the last generation who will know this, so the next generation I'm sure will. Well, no one names their kids Scott nowadays, so who cares? It's like the name Marnie. I'd never heard the name Marnie until I came to Canada, and now I'm convinced that Marnie is a Jewish girl from Toronto born in 1971. Okay, Chaim Schwartz. Who is Chaim Schwartz?
Hasidic.
Most likely, he is a Satmar Chassid living in Williamsburg or somewhere else, right? The name Schwartz is very common among Jews of Hungarian origin. The name Schwarz and Weiss are very common. Chaim Schwartz is a very common name. He's probably 22 or something like this. Okay? There's a possibility he's 85 or dead also, but he could be a young Hasidic guy.
Or Scott's son.
It's possible, but I would say, we'll come back to that. His name is Shlomi, his name is grandfather Scott. I don't think Chaim is very popular amongst young North American Jews outside of the Hasidic world. Max and Rose Schwartz probably donated a chair at my university. And they're probably angry right now.
Except that my grandchildren's generation
Are also using these names, that's
are
right.
using
We'll come back to that.
Max and
Max and Rose and Isaac and some of these other names are back in, that's right.
Sam,
Yep.
you know.
By the
That's
way,
right.
isn't Marnie the name of a film by Alfred Hitchcock, otherwise known as Alfred Hitchcock?
It could be, but I've never heard the name before I came to Canada. There are certain names that Canadians use that Americans don't use, and certain use that are associated with Canadian Jews, right? Who knew that Roots was a Canadian Jewish, how shall I say, badge of identity, unless you come to Toronto, right? Obviously not only for Jews, but Canadian Jews seem to have a particular, Canadian Jews love summer camps. There's
Both
Roots in
Americans.
summer.
Both of the originators of the company are
Yeah, but it's a very much a function of, it's very much just comes associated with Canadian. Like, in other words, none of this has any inherent meaning necessarily. It's largely sociological trends. Okay, of course, all of these, so many Jewish names are not Jewish in origin, meaning they don't come from a Hebrew source. Of course, we can debate is Hebrew the original Jewish language, and everything else is subsequent. I'm not going to enter that debate. Let's just say it is. Where do names come from? We know that plenty of Jewish names come from non-Jewish sources. Moses, Egyptian, Esther and Mordecai, Babylonian, Alexander, of course, Alexander the Great, Greek. Now, I have a theory that Alexander is very common amongst Russian-speaking Jews because Alexander is very common amongst Russian-speaking non-Jews. That for centuries, Jews weren't really using it. There's a story that Jews tell themselves, we've always used Alexander because Alexander the Great was so generous to Jews. He came to Jerusalem and visited the temple. It seems to the evidence suggests he never visited Jerusalem. Why would he stop by its backwaters? And probably Jews use the name at some point, but it probably gets a surge in popularity once Jews start to speak Russian. Todros, Greek, Yenta, from Gentili probably in Italian, Zlata, Slavic. There's actually a theory that Golda comes from Zlata. We used to think that Zlata came from Golda, because, Zlata, Golda, right, all, Zahava, Zahavit, all of these names that mean gold. Jews use a name and they translate to different languages, right? We think now that Ashkenazi Jews encountered Slavic-speaking Jews when they moved eastward. Slavic-speaking Jews used the name Zlata, and then it became translated into Yiddish, and that's how it became Golda. Okay? But this is, in other words, it's a process that's happened generation after generation. Fivish is related to Chaim. It's probably Romance origin, meaning life. Vitis, life. Bunim, bonum, probably Old French. It tells you something about the bear, or the animal. Medieval Ashkenazi Jews name their children very often after animals. And then to give gravitas to their names, added Hebrew components, dog, bear, and so on. Right. So there's nothing inherently Jewish necessarily about names themselves, but Jews do name their children in certain patterns that are distinctly Jewish. Right? The meaning of all of these names, of course, is determined by the social context. Now, this whole issue of borrowing names and the legal ramifications really becomes prominent, as I said, in the 19th century. I spoke about one aspect of this, the attempts to regulate it. But I'm going to speak about another aspect of it. On the left is the Chatam Sofer, the Chasim Sofer, often considered the forefather of ultra-Orthodoxy. When the German-speaking Jews begin to undergo the Enlightenment and begin to integrate into European society and acculturate, he launches a movement against this. There's a famous midrash that he helps to popularize. It existed before, but he helps to popularize in his ethical will that Jews were redeemed from, Israelites really, they were redeemed from captivity in Egypt for 3 reasons. Are you familiar with this midrash? Turns out the midrash is actually not even a midrash, but people assume it's a midrash. 3 things are dress, language, and names. They were worthy of redemption because they never changed their dress, never changed their language, they never changed their names. What he's really saying is, right now in the late 18th and 19th centuries, Jews in Central and Western Europe are beginning to change precisely these things, and we have to stop it now. Right? Traditional Ashkenazic names continue to speak Yiddish, don't adopt European dress, or don't adopt at least the European dress of the day. Of course, his dress was European; it was just not the dress of the European non-Jews, right? So he wants to stop all this change. On the other hand, you have Leopold Sunz, who was a famous scholar in the 19th century in Germany, a proponent of the Enlightenment and Jews' emancipation, one of the founding fathers of modern Jewish studies. He is hired by one of the Jewish communities in Germany after there's an attempt to promulgate a law forbidding Jews from adopting non-Jewish names, from adopting Christian names. Okay? And he does a lot of research, and most of the guys that I've mentioned before are mentioned on his research. His research is a start. Of course, by today's standards, it's primitive and there are errors. But what he basically demonstrates is there are no names that are inherently Christian, except perhaps a name like Christopher, right? Bearer of Christ. There are no names that are inherently Jewish. Therefore, there's no legal reason why Jews should be forbidden from adopting non-Jewish names. So they end up winning the case, and we get lots of Moritzes and so on. You don't have to be named, Moshe as Moses in the German Jewish pronunciation. You could now be Moritz. It's okay. Now, family names are a fascinating and complicated story. I can't tell you the entire story of family names because it varies too much from place to place. But I'm going to give you some general patterns. Okay, Sephardic Jews commonly had hereditary surnames long before Ashkenazi Jews. Going back to medieval Spain, they often had hereditary surnames. Ashkenazi Jews, like their neighbors, don't take surnames usually until the 19th century. And as I said, they don't usually take them very seriously until around the 20th century. Okay? And there's a whole variety of reasons that I mentioned, plus additional reasons such as avoiding the draft, changing your name to avoid the draft, or escaping a bad marriage, or trying to emigrate. There's a whole variety why Jews toss about their family names to their advantage. Because the names mean very little to them. I mean, what does it matter that my family got this name a few generations ago? I mean, this is one of the ironies of Jewish naming practices. Nowadays, when we say Jewish, someone changed his name, they usually mean they changed his family name to conceal himself as a Jew. Until recently, Jews didn't care about their family names. What they cared about was their first names. It's only really in the 20th century that changing your name meaning changing your family name, and that's, oh, who would do this but a Jew? It becomes an anti-Semitic trope. How Jewish, he changed his name, right? But Jews did not care very much about these things until the 20th century for the most part. Okay, how do Jews get their names? The states require them to take on new names. There are a variety of schemes whereby state officials or Jewish communities propose names and assign them to people. The names are usually German or Slavic if you're Ashkenazi, depending on what the official languages of the place you're living. So for Austria-Hungary and German countries, obviously, German states, because Germany is not unified until 1871, the language of state is German. It's going to be a German-sounding name. There are some places in Eastern Europe where they give Yiddish names, particularly in Ukraine, but usually the names in parts of Poland that belong to the Russian Empire are Slavic. And this is also true of names in Czech territory and names that are in Russian territories. Okay? So, your family's from Galicia, which used to be a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's part Poland today, part Ukraine. You probably have a German name, even though the bulk of the population was Polish or Ukrainian speaking. But not necessarily. People move around. If you came from German country, like Germany or Austria, you definitely had a German name. If you came from further east, you may have had a Russian name. There are some Lithuanian names too. There's a whole variety of schemes. There are a few regions where the Jewish communities themselves assign the names with the state's approval, and that's where you typically get Yiddish names. So you can see the same names repeat themselves in various forms. There's a famous scholar I'm writing a book about now called Solomon Birnbaum. I won't get into his personal story, but his father is the man, Nathan Birnbaum, who created the term Zionism. In any case, Birnbaum himself was a very famous Yiddish scholar who ends up here in Toronto.